The lawyer woke up to the blaring sound of his alarm clock, his heart racing, as he glanced at the time, realizing he had overslept for his early morning flight. The stakes of this trip were higher than usual. This was not just another business meeting. It was a deal that could secure his future with a prestigious law firm for years to come. As he scrambled to get ready, his mind raced with thoughts of the case he had spent months preparing for, the intricacies of the arguments, the legal documents scattered across his desk. His phone buzzed nonstop with messages from colleagues, but he could not afford to get distracted. The flight was his top priority. Now he grabbed his briefcase filled with important files and rushed out of the door, hoping to make it to the airport in time. Traffic was brutal as expected, but the lawyer kept his focus, his fingers tapping nervously on the steering wheel as he tried to make sense of the chaos around him. The red lights seemed to stretch on forever, and with every passing minute his anxiety increased. He wasn't just worried about missing his flight, but about the chance to prove himself and secure the promotion he had worked tirelessly for in the past few years. The firm had a big decision to make, and he had to make the best impression possible. Time seemed to be running against him, but somehow he managed to pull into the airport parking lot with just enough time to check in and get through security. Once inside the terminal, the lawyer breathed a sigh of relief. The airport was crowded as usual, but he was thankful for the lack of long lines today. He quickly grabbed a coffee from the nearby kiosk. As he moved toward his gate, his mind still preoccupied with the meeting ahead. He had a lot riding on it, and he couldn't afford any distractions. The flight itself was meant to be a brief break from the chaos of his professional life, a few hours to relax and mentally prepare for the meeting to come. But as he made his way toward the boarding gate, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As he approached the gate, he noticed a few passengers gathered around, talking in hushed voices. Most of them were already seated, but there was one figure standing near the front of the line, the airline pilot. He stood there in his uniform, scanning the crowd with a critical eye, and as the lawyer came closer, he could feel the man's gaze fall on him, a quick glance that seemed to last just a little too long for comfort. It was subtle, but the lawyer couldn't ignore the discomfort that surged through him, a prickling feeling on the back of his neck, as if he had done something wrong. But he quickly dismissed it, brushing off the moment as nothing more than a random interaction. Little did he know that this was the beginning of something much larger than a fleeting glance. The pilot's sharp eyes lingered on him, a flash of judgment behind the gaze. The lawyer couldn't read the look, but he certainly felt it. It was something in the way the man sized him up. In the seconds before the announcement to board the flight echoed over the intercom, the lawyer's attention snapped back to the task at hand. But the feeling of unease followed him as he moved into the line for boarding. As he handed over his ticket to the gate agent, he caught another glimpse of the pilot, his eyes narrowing slightly as the lawyer passed by. It was almost imperceptible, but the lawyer felt it like a weight settling in his chest. He moved forward, thinking that perhaps he was just being paranoid. The lawyer was used to being in high-stress situations, and this was nothing new. But as he settled into his seat, and the plane began to taxi down the runway, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. His mind kept racing through the details of the case and the potential complications he had to deal with. But no matter how hard he tried to focus on the task ahead, he couldn't ignore the strange sensation that something was off. It was as if he had walked into a storm without realizing the clouds had already gathered overhead. And then, just as the plane was about to take off, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, giving the standard pre-flight announcement. But there was something different about the way he spoke, a slight pause before addressing the passengers, an odd tension hanging in the air, a feeling that would soon turn from uneasy to undeniable. The lawyer woke up to the blaring sound of his alarm clock, his heart racing. As he glanced at the time, realizing he had overslept for his early morning flight, the stakes of this trip were higher than usual. This was not just another business meeting. It was a deal that could secure his future with a prestigious law firm for years to come. As he scrambled to get ready, his mind raced with thoughts of the case he had spent months preparing for, the intricacies of the arguments, the legal documents scattered across his desk. His phone buzzed nonstop with messages from colleagues, but he could not afford to get distracted. The flight was his top priority. Now he grabbed his briefcase filled with important files and rushed out of the door, hoping to make it to the airport in time. Traffic was brutal as expected, but the lawyer kept his focus, his fingers tapping nervously on the steering wheel. As he tried to make sense of the chaos around him, the red lights seemed to stretch on forever, and with every passing minute his anxiety increased. He wasn't just worried about missing his flight, but about the chance to prove himself and secure the promotion he had worked tirelessly for in the past few years. The firm had a big decision to make, and he had to make the best impression possible. Time seemed to be running against him, but somehow he managed to pull into the airport parking lot with just enough time to check in and get through security. Once inside the terminal, the lawyer breathed a sigh of relief. The airport was crowded as usual, but he was thankful for the lack of long lines today. He quickly grabbed a coffee from the nearby kiosk. As he moved toward his gate, his mind still preoccupied with the meeting ahead. He had a lot riding on it, and he couldn't afford any distractions. The flight itself was meant to be a brief break from the chaos of his professional life, a few hours to relax and mentally prepare for the meeting to come. But as he made his way toward the boarding gate, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As he approached the gate, he noticed a few passengers gathered around talking in hushed voices. Most of them were already seated, but there was one figure standing near the front of the line, the airline pilot. He stood there in his uniform, scanning the crowd with a critical eye. And as the lawyer came closer, he could feel the man's gaze fall on him, a quick glance that seemed to last just a little too long for comfort. It was subtle, but the lawyer couldn't ignore the discomfort that surged through him, a prickling feeling on the back of his neck, as if he had done something wrong. But he quickly dismissed it, brushing off the moment as nothing more than a random interaction. Little did he know that this was the beginning of something much larger than a fleeting glance. The pilot's sharp eyes lingered on him, a flash of judgment behind the gaze. The lawyer couldn't read the look, but he certainly felt it. It was something in the way the man sized him up in the seconds before the announcement to board the flight echoed over the intercom. The lawyer's attention snapped back to the task at hand, but the feeling of unease followed him as he moved into the line for boarding. As he handed over his ticket to the gate agent, he caught another glimpse of the pilot, his eyes narrowing slightly as the lawyer passed by. It was almost imperceptible, but the lawyer felt it like a weight settling in his chest. He moved forward, thinking that perhaps he was just being paranoid. The lawyer was used to being in high-stress situations, and this was nothing new. But as he settled into his seat, and the plane began to taxi down the runway, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. His mind kept racing through the details of the case and the potential complications he had to deal with. But no matter how hard he tried to focus on the task ahead, he couldn't ignore the strange sensation that something was off. It was as if he had walked into a storm without realizing the clouds had already gathered overhead. And then, just as the plane was about to take off, the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, giving the standard pre-flight announcement. But there was something different about the way he spoke, a slight pause before addressing the passengers, an odd tension hanging in the air, a feeling that would soon turn from uneasy to undeniable. As the plane finally came to a stop at the gate, the lawyer felt a knot tighten in his stomach. His eyes moved from the flight attendants to the cockpit door, which remained closed and silent for what felt like an eternity. The minutes ticked by, and an unsettling stillness lingered in the cabin. The passengers sat in confusion. Some glanced at each other, exchanging puzzled looks, while others remained absorbed in their own worlds. The flight attendants whispered among themselves, their hushed voices rising and falling with the occasional glance toward the cockpit. Finally, the door to the cockpit opened, and the pilot stepped out, his posture stiff and rigid, his eyes scanning the cabin as if he were looking for something or someone. The lawyer's breath caught in his throat. The pilot's gaze locked onto his, the same cold, judgmental stare from earlier, now sharper, more intense. It sent a chill down his spine. The flight attendant standing by the aisle looked toward the pilot and nodded as if awaiting his instructions. The tension in the air was palpable. The lawyer felt the weight of the pilot's gaze pressing on him, as though it had become personal. Something inside him shifted. He could feel a sense of danger rising. Something wasn't right here. The pilot walked toward the front of the plane, his movements deliberate and slow, as if drawing out the moment. The lawyer's heart began to race, his mind scrambling for an explanation for the strange unease that had settled over him. He had been on flights countless times before, but nothing had ever felt this charged, this uncomfortable, this personal. The pilot reached the front and spoke briefly to the flight attendant, who immediately nodded and began walking down the aisle. The passengers shifted nervously in their seats, sensing that something was about to happen, something unexpected. The lawyer's instincts screamed at him to stay calm, but his gut told him that this situation was spiraling out of control. The pilot turned to face the cabin, his voice suddenly booming over the intercom, a sharp edge in his tone. "We have a situation that requires immediate action. I'm afraid one of the passengers will need to be removed from the flight." The lawyer's heart skipped a beat. He could feel the eyes of everyone on him. His palms began to sweat as his thoughts raced. Was this some kind of mistake? Surely the pilot wasn't talking about him. The lawyer's eyes darted around the cabin, searching for any signs of explanation or reassurance, but all he saw were confused faces and whispered conversations. His throat tightened as the realization began to sink in. The pilot wasn't talking about anyone else, he was talking about him. The pilot's eyes had never left him. And now it was clear that something was happening, something more than just a routine flight issue. The lawyer's mind spun as he tried to understand what had just been said. But before he could make sense of it, the flight attendant approached him with a polite but firm expression. She spoke in a calm tone, but the words were laced with authority. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the plane. Please follow me." The lawyer's mouth went dry as he processed the words, his mind racing in disbelief. Leave the plane, but why? He opened his mouth to protest, but before he could say anything, the flight attendant gently but firmly gestured for him to stand up. The weight of the situation settled on him like a ton of bricks. He had no idea why this was happening, or what had led to this point, but every instinct told him that he was about to face something that could change everything. His thoughts raced. He couldn't believe this was happening, not to him, not in this way. The idea of being kicked off a flight in front of so many passengers was humiliating and surreal, but something about the pilot's cold gaze made it clear that resistance would only make things worse. He rose slowly from his seat, his briefcase now feeling like a heavy burden. His body stiffened with tension as he made his way down the aisle. The entire cabin seemed to watch in silence, every eye fixed on him. The flight attendants led him to the exit door, where he paused for a moment, his heart thumping in his chest. But before he could take another step, the pilot appeared in the doorway, blocking his path. The lawyer's breath caught in his throat as the pilot's stern expression locked onto him. Once again, this time there was no hiding the disdain in the man's eyes. It was undeniable. The lawyer's mind raced for a reason, for an explanation, but none came as the pilot's voice rang out cold and unforgiving. "Sir, we have no choice but to remove you from the flight. Please step outside now." The lawyer's stomach churned with the realization that this was no mistake, no misunderstanding. The pilot had made up his mind, and nothing was going to change it. The lawyer stood frozen at the doorway, staring at the pilot with disbelief and rising anger. His body tensed, and his heart pounded in his chest. He had been in tense situations before, but nothing compared to this. The public humiliation, the abruptness of the pilot's words, it felt surreal. But as he stood there, he realized that the more he hesitated, the more the situation would spiral out of control. The passengers were watching, waiting for him to act. But all he could do was stare back at the pilot. The lawyer wanted to argue, to demand an explanation, but the coldness in the pilot's eyes silenced him. The flight attendant stood to the side, her gaze sympathetic but firm. She said nothing. Her job was to follow orders, and it was clear that this was no longer a simple case of a misplaced ticket or a minor disruption. The lawyer took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His mind raced with options, but the only way forward was through the door. He couldn't imagine the consequences of resisting, but the idea of being dragged off the plane was something he couldn't fathom. And yet here he was, a sense of injustice rising in his chest. It burned like a fire, threatening to consume him. He knew that his professional reputation and future were on the line. This was supposed to be just another flight, but it had turned into something much more sinister. The look in the pilot's eyes was unmistakable. It wasn't just a matter of protocol or safety, it was personal somehow, and that made it all the more dangerous. With one final glance at the passengers who had been watching him all along, he turned slowly and walked toward the exit. The flight attendants followed closely behind, As he stepped out onto the tarmac, the cold air hit his face sharply, and for a moment he felt a wave of confusion and anger wash over him. How could this be happening? Why him? What had he done to deserve this? But there was no time for questions. The door slammed shut behind him, cutting off any chance of explanation from the cabin. He stood there for a moment, his thoughts swirling in the chaos of his mind, trying to grasp the reality of the situation. But as the sound of the engines faded in the distance, he realized that the plane was gone. He had been removed, and there was no going back. He stood alone in the quiet of the airport tarmac, watching as the plane he had been scheduled to board taxied down the runway. The humiliation of the moment began to settle in like a weight pressing down on him. He had been thrown off the flight with no explanation and no recourse. His anger began to boil over at the sheer absurdity of it all. He was a lawyer, a professional who had done nothing to deserve this treatment, and yet here he was a victim of some twisted injustice at the hands of a man he had never even spoken to. His mind flickered with thoughts of retaliation, but his focus quickly shifted to the reality of the situation. He had to get back to the terminal. He had to figure out what was going on and why this had happened. As he walked back toward the entrance to the airport, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A message from his colleague, reminding him of the importance of the meeting he was supposed to attend. His stomach twisted as he realized that this unexpected delay had cost him precious time. The meeting was slipping further out of reach, and the idea of explaining this situation to anyone at the firm made him feel sick to his core. He could already hear the questions, the doubts, the disbelief in their voices. How could he explain this to them? How could he explain being kicked off a flight for no reason other than the whim of a racist pilot? But in the silence of the tarmac, a voice inside him told him that this wasn't over, that this wasn't just about a missed meeting. It was about something deeper, something more significant, and he was determined to find out what it was. The lawyer made his way back into the terminal, his steps heavy with frustration and confusion. But as he approached the security checkpoint, his phone buzzed again, this time with a number he didn't recognize. He hesitated before answering, and when he did, the voice on the other end immediately made his blood run cold. It was the airline's customer service department, and they were calling to inform him that his removal from the flight had been a mistake. But there was no apology, not yet. Instead, the voice on the other end sounded distant and detached, as if the situation was already being treated as an afterthought. He was told that someone would reach out to him soon, but there was no guarantee that anything could be done to rectify the situation. The lawyer's jaw clenched as he hung up the phone. The situation was spiraling further out of his control, and he was just beginning to realize that the pilot's actions might have been far from an isolated incident. The lawyer stood there in the terminal, feeling the weight of the situation settle deeper into his bones. As the buzz of the airport continued around him, people moving through the security lines, oblivious to the storm that had just begun to rage inside him. He could still feel the eyes of the passengers on him, the judgment and confusion that had been etched into their faces. But the most disturbing image was the pilot's cold eyes staring down at him, the sense of disdain that had been so clear in that moment. The lawyer couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random incident. This wasn't about a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was something more sinister, something much darker. His mind spun with thoughts of what had just happened and why the pilot had singled him out. Was it because of his appearance or his profession? Or was there something deeper at play? A quiet voice in his head told him that this had nothing to do with a routine security concern. This was personal. But what could he do with that feeling? Where could he take it? The more he thought about it, the more the truth became undeniable. There was something about the pilot that made this moment stand out far beyond any simple act of discrimination. It felt like a calculated move, like the pilot had been waiting for an excuse to make his move. And now that it had happened, the lawyer couldn't let it go. He couldn't just walk away from this and pretend that nothing had happened. He knew he had to do something to get answers, even if it meant uncovering the truth piece by piece. With a newfound resolve, the lawyer decided to take action. He couldn't just leave things as they were. The airline had already dismissed his concerns, brushing off his experience with the cold indifference of a corporate machine. But the lawyer knew better than to let them sweep this under the rug. He picked up his phone and called the local news outlet he had worked with before when he had handled cases that required public attention. He explained the situation in as much detail as he could without revealing too much, but he could feel the wheels starting to turn. The voice on the other end of the line sounded intrigued and promised to look into the matter. He didn't know if this was the right move, but it was the only option he had left. He couldn't let the pilot's actions go unnoticed. He couldn't let them slide without consequences. He hung up and took a deep breath, feeling a strange sense of determination filling him. The lawyer knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he also knew that he couldn't allow himself to be silenced. Not when he had been wronged in such a blatant way. The truth needed to come out, and he was going to make sure it did, no matter the cost. The minutes passed in a blur as he paced the terminal, waiting for any sign that things were starting to move, waiting for a breakthrough. But for now, all he could do was wait and hope that his decision to speak out would lead to something that would bring the pilot's actions into the light. Hours passed, and the lawyer barely noticed the time slipping by as he waited for the next step. The anxiety of the situation gnawed at him, but there was no going back now. He had taken the first step, and now he had to see it through, no matter what it took. He had to make sure that this wasn't just another story that would be buried beneath the weight of indifference and bureaucracy. He wasn't going to let the airline or the pilot get away with what had happened, not when so many people were depending on him to make it right. But in the silence of the terminal, with only his thoughts to keep him company, the lawyer couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than met the eye. He felt like he was on the verge of something bigger than he could have imagined, a system of prejudice that stretched deeper than just one pilot and one flight. It was a system that needed to be exposed, and the lawyer knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger fight. He couldn't help but wonder how many others had been treated the way he had, how many stories had been buried over the years, how many injustices had gone unnoticed and unchallenged, how many others had been subjected to the same kind of treatment by those who held power in their hands. The more he thought about it, the more his determination grew. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for something much bigger than his own personal humiliation. He was fighting for the truth, and for everyone who had been silenced before him. The lawyer knew that the fight ahead would be difficult, but it was one that he had no choice but to face head-on. The lawyer sat in the terminal waiting for any kind of response, but the longer he waited, the more the frustration built inside him. Every passing minute felt like a small eternity as his mind spun through the possibilities of what would happen next. He couldn't stop thinking about the way the pilot had looked at him with such coldness, and how that moment had set everything into motion. It was as if the pilot had already made up his mind about him before they had even boarded the plane. The lawyer couldn't help but wonder if there were others like him, others who had been treated unfairly or worse, simply because of who they were or what they did. The more he thought about it, the more the idea seemed plausible. It was clear to him now that this wasn't just a case of a bad day or a misunderstanding. It was part of something deeper, something systemic that needed to be addressed, and he was the one who was going to do it. As the minutes stretched into hours, the lawyer grew impatient. He had done everything he could at this point to get the ball rolling, but it seemed like everyone else was moving at a slower pace. He called the news outlet again to follow up, but was told that they were still looking into the situation and that he would be contacted soon. It was the same response he had heard before, and each time it made him feel more isolated, more alone in this fight. He knew that he couldn't back down now, but the waiting was starting to eat away at his resolve. The unknown stretched out in front of him like a long, dark road with no clear end in sight. He had put his faith in the system, but what if the system failed him? What if his story was just one more in a long line of forgotten injustices? His phone buzzed again, and this time it was an email from the airline's customer service department. He opened it quickly, hoping for some kind of resolution, but when he read the words, his heart sank. The email apologized for the inconvenience and assured him that an investigation into the situation would be conducted, but it offered no real answers, no real action, just a vague promise that someone would get back to him soon. The lawyer's grip tightened on his phone as he read the message over and over again. He could see right through it. They were stalling, hoping that he would get tired and give up, but he wasn't going to let them off that easily. He wasn't going to be ignored, not this time. The anger inside him flared as he realized how little respect the airline had for him or his experience, how little they cared about what had actually happened to him. They didn't see him as a person, they didn't see the injustice they had inflicted on him, they only saw a complaint that they could sweep under the rug. But he wasn't going to let that happen, he wasn't going to let them diminish his experience, like it was nothing. He had worked too hard for too long to get to this point. And now he was going to make sure that the truth was heard no matter how difficult it was or how long it took. The lawyer stood up abruptly, his legs stiff from sitting for so long. He could feel the frustration bubbling over inside him. As he walked toward the nearest airport lounge, he needed to get away from the chaos of the terminal for a moment and think clearly. He wasn't going to let this go. He couldn't. The fight had become personal now, and he was determined to see it through to the end. He sat down in one of the lounge chairs and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the weight of everything wash over him. He thought about his career, his reputation, and the case that had been the whole reason he was on that plane in the first place. The flight he had been removed from had been meant to help him get to the meeting that could change everything for him. But now that seemed irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the injustice he had experienced and the bigger picture that had unfolded in front of him. He opened his eyes and took a deep breath. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been discriminated against or wronged by those in power. It was about standing up against a system that allowed this kind of behavior to persist without consequence. He was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced and dismissed by those who thought they could get away with it. He felt a renewed sense of purpose surge through him as he stood up from the chair, with his resolve hardening. The battle had only just begun, and he was ready to take the next step, no matter where it led him. As he made his way back toward the terminal, the lawyer felt something shift within him, something stronger than before. He wasn't going to wait for anyone else to take action. He wasn't going to let this injustice slide into the background like so many others had before him. This time, it would be different. He would make sure of it. And no matter how long it took or how many obstacles lay in his path, he would fight for the truth and for the people who needed him to stand up for them more than ever. The lawyer felt a surge of adrenaline as he left the lounge and made his way back into the terminal, his steps quick and purposeful with each stride. He grew more certain that he wasn't going to let this moment slip. He wasn't going to be just another passive participant in a broken system. The injustice he had experienced had ignited something inside him, a fire that refused to be extinguished. He thought of all the people who had suffered in silence before him, the ones who had been treated with disrespect and cruelty by those in power, the ones whose voices had been silenced because they didn't have the means or the platform to fight back. And in that moment, the lawyer realized that he had to be their voice. He couldn't let this go unnoticed. He couldn't let the system keep trampling on people like it had with him. He walked purposefully to the nearest airline customer service desk, his mind focused and sharp. As he approached the woman behind the counter, she looked up as he approached, offering a quick smile that faltered when she saw the determination in his eyes. He didn't smile back. He wasn't here to make small talk or play nice. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He took a deep breath before speaking calmly but firmly. I need to speak to someone in charge, someone who can give me real answers about what happened today. The woman blinked in surprise, clearly not expecting such a direct approach, but quickly recovered and nodded. I'll have someone come speak with you. Just a moment, please, she said before walking off. The lawyer stood there, feeling the eyes of other passengers on him, some curious, some annoyed. He ignored them and focused on what was ahead. He was done waiting for vague responses and empty promises. This was real, and it was happening right now. He had been wronged in a way that couldn't be justified or swept aside, and he wasn't going to let the airline pretend like it had never happened. The minutes dragged on before a man in a dark suit approached him. His expression was neutral, but his posture suggested that he was used to dealing with complaints and trying to resolve them quickly. The lawyer took a deep breath and immediately began speaking. I was removed from a flight earlier today under completely unjustified circumstances. I need to know why and what steps are being taken to address this issue. I'm not leaving until I get an explanation. The man's face remained unreadable, but he gestured for the lawyer to follow him to a more private area of the terminal. As they walked, the lawyer's heart raced. He had no idea what to expect from this meeting, but he knew that it was his best shot at getting to the truth. The man led him to a small conference room and gestured for him to sit down. Once they were both seated, the man spoke in a calm, professional tone. "Sir, I understand you've had an unpleasant experience, and I assure you that we take these matters seriously. I'm here to listen and try to resolve the situation to your satisfaction. But I need to hear your side of the story." The lawyer leaned forward, his frustration still simmering beneath the surface, but he kept his voice steady. This was his moment to be heard, and he wasn't going to waste it. The lawyer recounted everything that had happened from the moment he boarded the flight to the moment he had been removed without explanation. He didn't leave anything out. He wanted the man to hear the full extent of the disrespect and injustice he had endured, and when he finished speaking, he sat back waiting for a response. The man across from him nodded thoughtfully before speaking again. "Thank you for sharing that with me," he said, his voice still even and calm. "I'm sure you can understand that we have strict policies and procedures in place for situations like this, but I'll be honest with you, I don't have all the information at the moment. But I will personally ensure that this situation is fully investigated and that you will receive a follow-up response as soon as possible." The lawyer could feel his anger rising again. This wasn't what he wanted to hear. He didn't want vague promises or reassurances. He wanted accountability. With a deep breath, he leaned forward again and looked the man directly in the eye. "I appreciate that you're taking the time to listen, but I need you to understand something. This isn't just about me. This is about how your airline treats people, how passengers are treated by the people in charge. I've seen firsthand the way your employees treat customers, and it's not acceptable. I need to know that this isn't just going to be brushed aside, because that's what always happens with these kinds of things. People speak up, and nothing changes. But this time it's going to be different. You understand that, right?" The man didn't say anything for a moment. His eyes flickered as though weighing the lawyer's words carefully. Finally, he nodded once more. "I understand, sir," he said. "I can't make any promises right now, but I will ensure that this is handled and that you get the answers you deserve." The lawyer stood up, feeling the heat of the conversation, but also a glimmer of hope that perhaps this time things would be different. Perhaps his voice would matter enough to bring about a change. He shook the man's hand firmly and left the conference room, his heart still racing, but this time with a sense of purpose. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He had made his point, and now it was up to them to do the right thing. But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The real fight was still ahead of him, and he was ready for it. No matter what it took, he would get the justice he deserved, and more than that, he would make sure that no one else ever had to go through what he had. The lawyer left the conference room with his head held high, but inside his thoughts churned with uncertainty. The words from the airline representative echoed in his mind. "I will ensure that this is handled and that you get the answers you deserve." But he had heard promises like these before, and they had never led to anything tangible. He had seen how easily people in power could brush off complaints, how they could make people feel like they were insignificant, just another voice in a sea of others. He knew that the road ahead would be long and full of obstacles, but he couldn't back down, not now. He had come too far, and he had too much to lose to let this moment slip away into the ether of forgotten injustices. As he made his way back to the main terminal, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him again. The time he had spent waiting, the meetings, the phone calls, the emotional toll, it was all starting to add up. He needed to clear his mind. He needed a break. But he couldn't allow himself to relax, not yet. He couldn't forget the fire that had been ignited inside him, the fire that had led him to take action when so many others would have just walked away. But as he sat down in the terminal and glanced around at the people passing by, he realized that this was bigger than just him. It was about everyone who had been wronged by the system, the people who had been ignored or mistreated because they didn't have the means to speak up or the strength to stand against the tide of indifference. His phone buzzed again, breaking his train of thought. It was an email from the airline's legal department. This time, a formal response acknowledging the complaint and promising to review the situation. But again, no concrete details, just more vague assurances. The lawyer's eyes narrowed as he read through the message. His fingers tightened around the phone, as he thought about the injustice he had experienced, and how little the airlines seemed to care about it, how easy it was for them to send a generic email and pretend like nothing had happened. But he wasn't going to let them get away with it. He had already taken the first step, and now he had to keep pushing. He wasn't going to let them dismiss him or his story so easily. He had already fought too hard to back down now. With a sense of renewed determination, he called the news outlet again. This time, he made sure to emphasize how important it was for the story to be covered. He needed the public to know what had happened to him, and to see the airline for what it truly was, a company that thought it could mistreat passengers without facing any consequences. The voice on the other end of the line seemed more receptive this time, and promised to look into it further. They would send a reporter to the airport for an interview and cover the story. He felt a small sense of victory at the thought of his story being shared with a wider audience. But deep down he knew that this was just the beginning. The real battle would be in getting the airline to face the consequences of their actions and to hold the pilot accountable for what he had done. As he hung up the phone, the lawyer took a deep breath and glanced around the terminal once more. He could feel the eyes of the passengers on him again. But this time it was different. He wasn't the man who had been removed from a flight. He wasn't the man who had been humiliated by a pilot. He was the man who was standing up for what was right. And he was ready to face whatever came next. The journey was far from over, but he knew that he was on the right path. The fight would be long and hard, but he wasn't alone in it anymore. He had found his voice, and now it was time for the world to hear it. As he walked toward the exit, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something bigger than he had ever imagined, a movement that would challenge the system and bring about real change. He didn't know how it would unfold or how long it would take, but he knew that he was ready to see it through. No matter what the future held, he had already made a difference. And as he stepped out into the bright sunlight of the airport parking lot, he knew that this was only the first step on a much larger journey, one that would not only change his life, but the lives of others who had been mistreated and ignored for far too long. He had started something, and he wasn't going to stop until it was finished.